Soviet colonel looked at the forged papers, then looked back into the prisoner's eyes. 50 days earlier, this man had escaped from the most feared labor camp in Siberia. Now the one officer who knew exactly who he was, the one man alive who understood how his mind worked, had only one sentence left to say. Why would the officer who had spent almost 2 months hunting this prisoner across the coldest ground on earth suddenly let him walk free? To understand that single, quiet sentence, and everything it cost both men to arrive at it, we have to go back 8 years earlier. Before Siberia, Jakub Nowak was not a soldier. He was a surveyor. For 11 years before the war reached his town, Jakub had walked the hills of southern Poland with a theodolite strapped to his back, measuring the exact curve of the land so that roads could be built where old dirt paths used to wind. He had a gift, the kind people notice without understanding it. He could look at a valley once and hold its shape in his mind for years afterward, every ridge and drop of it, the way other men remembered faces. His wife Iwa used to tease him about it. She would ask him to describe the walk from the church to her mother's house, a walk he had made maybe a dozen times, and he would recite it turn by turn, including the crooked fence post that leaned 2 degrees to the left, as if he were reading it off a page. When the war came, that skill made him valuable to the wrong people. He was accused, without much evidence, of using his survey work to pass information to partisans hiding in the hills. The accusation came from a neighbor, a man Jakub had once shared a fence line with, someone who owed him nothing and had never been given a reason to lie except that lying, in those years, was sometimes the only way to protect yourself from being accused of something worse. The arrest itself took less than 10 minutes. 2 officers arrived at the house at dusk, polite in the particular, chilling way that meant the outcome had already been decided somewhere else. Jakub was given time to put on a coat. He was not given time to say goodbye properly, only to stand in the doorway while Ewa held Marta and asked, calmly, exactly the kind of question a surveyor's wife would ask, "When will you be back?" as though this were a work trip and not the end of the only life either of them had built together. He did not have an answer. He still did not have one 8 years later. In the autumn of 1945, he was put on a train heading east, packed into a car with 40 other men who did not yet know which of them would still be alive by spring. The last thing he saw of his old life was Ewa standing at the platform, holding their daughter, who was not yet 3 and would not remember his face by the time she was 6. He watched the platform until it disappeared behind a bend in the track, and then he closed his eyes and did the only thing he knew how to do with fear. He started walking the route from the church to Ewa's mother's house in his mind, turn by turn, the crooked fence post included, because it was the one thing in the world that had not changed in the last 10 minutes. He had no way of knowing yet that this same habit, the quiet, private trick of memorizing ground, would one day be the only thing standing between him and a grave with no name on it. Jakub arrived at Camp 9 in late winter, after a journey east that had taken 19 days by train and another 6 on foot, roped together with the other men in a column that lost 3 of its number to cold before they ever saw the gate. His first sight of the camp was a low huddle of buildings against a white horizon so featureless that for a moment he genuinely could not tell where the ground ended and the sky began. It was the first time in his life that a landscape had refused to make sense to him, and something about that refusal frightened him more than the guards or the dogs or the barbed wire ever quite managed to. The camp had no official name the prisoners ever used. They called it Camp 9, after the 9th kilometer marker on the dirt road connecting it to a railway junction that connected to nothing anyone cared about. Coal came out of a mine shaft sunk into a low ridge above the camp. The dust got into everything. The warden was Colonel Antonov Petrovich, a man who had once been a promising reconnaissance officer, tracked for a planning posting in Moscow, until a mapping error under his authority sent an entire company into a ravine his charts did not show. 41 men died in the ambush that followed. Whether the error was his own or a subordinate's was never settled by any tribunal, and Petrovich himself, according to men who had served under him before Camp 9, never once tried to argue his own innocence in front of anyone. He was reassigned somewhere his talents would matter less. Camp 9 was as far from Moscow, professionally and literally, as a man could be sent without it being called a demotion on paper. Petrovich did not hate prisoners in the abstract. He hated maps that lied to him, and men who thought they understood terrain better than he did. He ran the camp with an exactness that had nowhere better to be spent, checking supply counts twice, questioning guards who reported distances that didn't match his own mental sense of the ground, correcting junior officers on details no one else would have thought to notice. The prisoners learned quickly that Petrovich's attention was worse than his anger. Anger passed. Attention lingered. He did not know yet that the camp itself was about to become far more dangerous than the cold ever had been, in ways that had nothing to do with weather at all. By the start of Jakub's second year, conditions at Camp 9 had shifted in ways that made staying feel less and less like the safer option. New production quotas arrived from regional command that winter, demanding almost 40% more coal out of the same mine with the same number of men. The extra hours came out of sleep, and the extra risk came out of shortcuts nobody wanted to take but nobody was permitted to refuse. A support beam that should have been replaced was patched instead. A ventilation shaft that should have been cleared stayed half-blocked for weeks. Jakub's closest friend at the camp by then was a former schoolteacher named Henrik, a quiet, careful man who had taught Jakub to trade cigarettes for information and had, in exchange, learned from Jakub how to keep his hands steady enough during work details to avoid drawing a guard's attention. In the spring, a section of that patched support beam gave way 2 levels down in the mine, and Henrik, working the shift below, did not come back up. Jakub was not there when it happened. He heard about it that evening, secondhand, the way most deaths at Camp 9 were learned about, a name simply missing at roll call, no ceremony, no explanation beyond a guard's flat statement that the shift quota would be adjusted to cover the loss. He was given Henrik's old bunk assignment 2 days later, a small, practical cruelty that was not intended as cruelty at all, simply the camp's way of not wasting space. He lay in it that first night with his eyes open, listening to the same coughing, the same restless shifting of 40 other men trying to sleep off exhaustion that never fully left their bodies, and thought about how easily a name could simply stop appearing on a list. That night, for the first time since Bruno had died at the tree line, Jakub allowed himself to feel something close to rage rather than fear. He said nothing to anyone. He simply understood, with a clarity that had been building for a year, that staying inside the wire was no longer the cautious choice. It had only ever looked that way. The real risk had been staying still while the ground underneath every one of them kept getting worse. Around the same time, rumors began circulating among the older prisoners, the kind of rumor that traveled through a camp faster than any official notice ever could, that an even harsher facility further north was being expanded, and that Camp 9's technical prisoners, men with useful skills like Jakub's, were the ones most likely to be sent there once the current quota crisis passed. One older prisoner, a former railway engineer who had survived 3 winters at Camp 9 already, told Jakub quietly one evening that he had heard from a guard, in exchange for a week's worth of traded rations, that the northern facility's own mine had already claimed nearly double the deaths of Camp 9's in the same period, and that the men sent there rarely lasted past their second winter. Jakub did not know yet whether any of it was true, but for the first time, he stopped asking himself whether he should attempt an escape, and started asking only when. He did not know that Petrovich, in his own quarters that same week, had begun asking a very different question about him, one that had nothing to do with production quotas or transfer lists, and everything to do with a file he had quietly requested be pulled and reread, twice, alone, late at night, long after the rest of the camp had gone dark. Jakub survived his first months by becoming small. He spoke little, kept his eyes down at roll call, learned which guards could be reasoned with and which enjoyed being asked so they could refuse. Then, 4 months into his sentence, at 2 in the morning, whistles went off across the camp. A barracks search, unannounced, the kind that happened every so often to remind everyone that nothing was truly theirs. Guards tore through bunks, dumped ration tins, ripped seams open looking for hidden blades, letters, anything. Jakub had nothing written down. That was the rule he had already set for himself, even that early, without fully knowing why. But he had, tucked inside his boot, a small piece of magnetized metal, salvaged from a broken lantern, the first component of what would eventually become a compass. A guard picked up his boot, turned it over, shook it once. The metal fragment, small and flat, stayed wedged in the seam where the sole met the leather and did not fall. Jakub did not breathe until the guard tossed the boot back onto the pile and moved to the next bunk. That night, lying awake, he understood something clearly for the first time. Whatever he built toward freedom would need to exist somewhere no search could ever reach. Not in his boot, not on paper. In his memory, the same place he had always kept the true shape of the valleys back home. He did not know yet that hiding the plan from the guards would turn out to be the easier problem. Hiding it from himself, from the doubt that was already starting to grow underneath his discipline, would prove far harder. 2 months later, a prisoner 3 bunks down, a former railway clerk named Bruno, tried to run. He went during a work march, breaking from the line in a panic when a guard turned his back, sprinting for a tree line that was, Jakub calculated instantly, and without wanting to, at least 4 kilometers away, across open ground. Bruno did not make it 200 meters. The camp was made to watch the aftermath. Petrovich did not shout. He walked the line of prisoners slowly, and when he reached Jakub, he stopped. "You're the surveyor," Petrovich said, not a question. Jakub said nothing. "I read your file," Petrovich said. "You measured roads. You'd know, better than most, how far that tree line actually was." Jakub kept his eyes on the ground, the way he had trained himself to. "I wouldn't know, Colonel." Petrovich studied him a long moment, the particular way one professional studies another, and then walked on. Nothing more was said. But Jakub understood, standing there with Bruno's body still visible at the edge of the trees, that Petrovich had already marked him as a different category of prisoner than the others. This was the first time Jakub felt truly afraid inside the wire, more afraid than he had felt on the train east. That night, lying in the dark, Jakub did something he never admitted to anyone, not even Theodore, not for years. He decided, quietly and completely, to give up on the idea of escape altogether. He told himself it had been foolish from the start, a fantasy built by a man who missed his family too much to think clearly, and that Bruno's death was proof of exactly what happened to men who let hope get ahead of sense. For nearly 3 weeks, he stopped counting paces during work marches. He stopped watching guard rotations. He let the habit that had kept him sane for over a year go quiet, and told himself this was wisdom rather than what it actually was, which was grief wearing the mask of caution. During those 3 weeks, he noticed something strange happening to himself, something that frightened him more than any guard ever had. He began sleeping more, eating whatever was given to him without the small, careful rationing he had practiced for months, speaking to the other prisoners with an ease he had not allowed himself since arriving at the camp. It felt in those 3 weeks almost like relief, the particular, hollow relief of a man who has stopped carrying a weight he told himself he never wanted in the first place. He nearly convinced himself he preferred it. It was Henrik who noticed first, and who said the one thing that pulled Jakub back from that quiet surrender. "You've stopped watching the guards," Henrik said one evening, not as an accusation, simply an observation from a man who paid attention to small changes in people, the way Jakub paid attention to small changes in terrain. "You used to watch everything, now you watch nothing." Jakub did not answer him that night, but 3 days later, without quite deciding to, he found himself counting paces again during the morning march, and did not stop. He would carry that 3-week lapse with him for the rest of his life, not as failure exactly, but as proof that even a mind built for patience and calculation could still, for a while, lose its nerve, and that the difference between giving up and continuing was sometimes nothing more than one other person noticing before it was too late. In the second year, Jakub was assigned to a work detail alongside Theodor, a former locksmith from Krakow sent to Camp 9 on charges as flimsy as Jakub's own. Where Jakub had learned to disappear, Theodor had learned to charm, trading small favors and information with guards in a constant, exhausting performance of usefulness. For months, Jakub avoided him, wary of exactly the kind of talk that got escape plans discovered. But Theodor was persistent, and lonely in the particular way that latched onto the quiet surveyor who never seemed afraid the way everyone else was. One night, half joking, half desperate, Theodor said something that changed everything. He'd overheard a guard bragging that Petrovich kept real survey maps in his own quarters, requisitioned years earlier for a cancelled mining project. Ink and paper, showing exactly what lay between Camp 9 and the border. Jakub made a decision that violated every rule he had set for himself. He told Theodor enough of his thinking to get him looking, during a cleaning assignment that occasionally sent prisoners into the administrative building. What happened 3 days later would nearly cost them both everything. A guard reported a missing chisel from the tool shed where Theodor sometimes worked, and Teodor was pulled aside for questioning, not about maps, but about a weapon he was suspected of sharpening. Jakub, watching from across the yard, felt something cold drop through his chest. He was certain 2 years of silence were about to end because of one conversation he should never have allowed. Worse, in his panic, Teodor very nearly said Jakub's name. He told it himself, weeks later, still shaking at the memory. The guard had asked who else worked near the tool shed that week, fishing for a second name to blame, and Teodor had opened his mouth to answer honestly out of pure reflex before catching himself and saying instead that he worked alone. A half-second of hesitation, nothing more. Teodor was cleared over the chisel by the end of the week. But the 40 minutes he had spent alone near Petrovich's office that day were not wasted. He never touched the maps. He was too afraid, correctly, that any movement toward the colonel's desk would be his last. But he looked, the way a locksmith looks, trained to notice mechanisms and exact positions of things. When he returned to the barracks that night, still shaking, he did something that surprised even himself. He drew, from memory, on a scrap of paper he then burned within the hour, everything he had managed to see. A general direction marked to the southwest, the name of a river, a distance figure in the colonel's own hand, glimpsed upside down. He handed the scrap to Jakub and said only, "I don't know if this means anything, but you should have it before I forget it." Neither of them yet knew that Petrovich had already begun watching the surveyor more closely than either of them realized. The calculation, once Jakub had Teodor's fragment layered against 2 years of his own memorized terrain, suggested a route reachable in perhaps 50 to 60 days on foot. No one had survived that long outside the wire from Camp 9, ever. But before Jakub could act on any of it, the rumors of a transfer north finally became official. A rotation order came down from regional command. Several prisoners with technical backgrounds, including surveyors, were being considered for the harsher facility the older prisoners had been warning about for months. For 6 days, Jakub did not know if his name was on the list. He kept working, kept his face empty, while inside he ran through the same nightmare on a loop. 2 years of memorized terrain, useless, because the terrain around a new camp would be entirely different, and he would have to start from nothing, older, weaker, with less time left in him to survive the process twice. On the 7th day, the list was posted. His name was not on it. He never learned exactly why, though he suspected, without ever being able to confirm it, that Petrovich had quietly kept him at Camp 9 on purpose. A man that interesting to study was not a man Petrovich wanted to hand off to another commander. Jakub took this as a warning rather than relief. Petrovich was paying closer attention than anyone realized. Whatever Jakub did next, it would need to be flawless. What Jakub did not yet understand was that the harder obstacle waiting for him was never going to be the colonel. It was going to be his own mind, at the very end of the journey, in a way no amount of preparation could fully prevent. He spent the following 4 months preparing rather than running. He traded meager rations for dried fish and hardened bread from other prisoners willing to sell, accepting hunger now for supplies later. He memorized the guard rotation with obsessive precision, identifying one shift, once every 11 days, when the northern perimeter was covered by a single aging guard, known to fall asleep near dawn. He stole, one piece at a time over months, the components of a crude compass, a needle, the magnetized fragment from his boot, enough to build something that would tell him direction when the sky was too overcast to read the sun. He told no one the exact date, not even Teodor. This was not distrust, it was protection. On the appointed night, in the rotation gap he had tracked for months, Jakub did not run toward the trees the way every failed escapee before him had. He walked, deliberately, at a pace he had calculated he could sustain for weeks, in a direction that had nothing to do with the shortest visible path to the forest. By the time his absence was noticed at the following morning's roll call, he had a 9-hour head start. Petrovich, informed of the escape, did not immediately send search parties sweeping the nearby forest the way he had for every escapee before. He asked one question first. He asked which direction the survey maps in his own quarters pointed toward, and when told the maps were untouched, still exactly where he had left them, he understood something that made his blood run cold in a very different way than the temperature outside. This prisoner had not needed to steal the maps. He had built his own. The chase that followed would take almost 2 months, across ground that had no name and no mercy for either of them, and neither man yet knew how it would end. A search patrol passed within earshot of where Jakub had bedded down in a shallow depression covered with cut branches. He lay motionless for nearly 2 hours, as boots crunched snow less than 30 meters away, voices carrying clearly enough that he could make out individual words. A dog barked once, twice, and Jakub's heart did not slow until the patrol's voices faded east, following a false trail his earlier, deliberately doubled-back tracks had laid for them 3 kilometers in the wrong direction. He had planned for this moment for months. He had not planned for how loud his own heartbeat would sound in his ears while it happened. A section of terrain he had mapped from a distant ridge as passable turned out, up close, to be a frozen bog. He broke through to the waist before clawing free, losing hours and soaking supplies he could not easily dry. That night, with wet clothing freezing stiff against his skin, he came closer to hypothermia than at any other point in the journey. It was here, shivering uncontrollably in the dark, that the doubt he thought he had buried after Bruno's death resurfaced. He found himself thinking, with a clarity that frightened him more than the cold did, that turning back toward the camp and accepting whatever punishment came might genuinely be the safer choice. He had, for perhaps 20 minutes, half convinced himself of it, running the calculation the way he ran every calculation, and arriving at an answer he did not like. He kept himself moving and awake by reciting the walk from the church to Ewa's mother's house over and over under his breath, not because it solved anything, but because it gave his mind somewhere to stand while the rest of him waited out the worst of the shaking. Whatever he decided that night, it would not be the last time the real danger came from inside his own head, rather than the weather around him. A blizzard hit without warning, visibility dropping to almost nothing within minutes. Jakub carved a narrow trench into a snowbank with his hands and the flat of Theodore's old knife, packed himself inside, and waited out 18 hours of wind that, by his own later account, sounded like something trying to tear the world apart. He came out half frozen, but alive, and found, once the storm cleared, that the compass he had built still pointed true. He found the frozen river Theodore had glimpsed on the colonel's map, exactly where his own calculations placed it. Crossing it meant testing ice that groaned under his weight with every step. Halfway across, one crack ran wider than the rest and dropped his back leg through to the knee. He threw himself flat and crawled the rest of the way rather than risk another step. He sat on the far bank a long while afterward, not celebrating, simply confirming his position against the sun. It matched. For the first time since the platform, since Ewa and Marta, he allowed himself to cry. Descending a rocky slope in poor light, Jakub's foot caught on a hidden root and he fell hard, wrenching his ankle badly enough that his vision went white for several seconds. He bound it tightly and continued at a slower pace. That same night, exhausted and moving more slowly than his schedule allowed, he heard, for the first time since leaving camp, the low, carrying call of wolves somewhere behind him in the dark. He found the tallest rock outcrop within reach, climbed it on an injured leg, and kept a small fire fed through the night. The calls circled twice, drew closer once, and then faded east sometime before dawn. He counted it, afterward, among the longest nights of the entire journey. But the worst danger of the 50 days was still ahead of him, and it would not announce itself with any sound at all. Hunger became critical. Weak and lightheaded, Jakub approached a trapping outpost run by an elderly trapper named Grigori, known to hold a long, quiet resentment toward the camp administration. Grigori studied him a long moment before deciding anything. What convinced him was not desperation in Jakub's face, but the fact that Jakub, half-starved, still asked precise questions about terrain to the southwest, confirming details rather than simply begging. He gave Jakub 3 days of food, a better knife, and one piece of information worth more than all of it combined. The border crossing Jakub had calculated was now more heavily patrolled than in previous years. A crossing 30 kilometers further south, near a legitimate rail customs checkpoint, was actually less guarded, precisely because authorities assumed no escaped prisoner would be reckless enough to approach somewhere so visible. A fever set in, chills and confusion severe enough that Jakub lost nearly a full day to delirium, walking through hallucinated conversations with Eva, and here, alone, feverish, farther from anything familiar than he had ever been in his life, Jakub reached the lowest point of the entire journey. He found himself, in a moment of total clarity between waves of delirium, seriously considering walking toward the nearest search patrol and simply surrendering. Not out of despair exactly, but out of a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made even freedom feel like more weight than he could carry another step. He later admitted, only once, years afterward, that he had actually turned in a direction he believed would intersect a patrol route and had walked nearly half a kilometer that way before some old, stubborn piece of himself, the same piece that had refused to stop watching the guards after Henrik's warning, turned him back around. He remembered, he said, standing still in the snow for a long moment, arguing with himself the way he had once argued with junior engineers over a disputed measurement back in Poland, laying out the case for surrender and the case against it, as though they were two competing survey results that needed to be reconciled before work could continue. The case for surrender was exhaustion, was fever, was the simple animal wish to stop being cold. The case against it was smaller, quieter, but in the end it won, and it consisted of exactly one image, held steady in his mind the way he had once held the shape of a valley. Marta's face, 3 years old, at the platform, the last true look at her he had ever gotten, and the certainty that if he turned himself in now, he would never get a second one. He forced himself to keep moving on legs that barely obeyed him, rationing what remained of Grigori's food, because he no longer trusted his own timeline, and because some part of him understood that if he stopped now, the version of himself that wanted to survive might not get another chance to argue his case. By the time the fever finally broke, 2 days later, Jakub had lost track of exactly how far he had walked during the worst of the delirium, and for the first time in the entire journey, he had to stop and rebuild his sense of position almost entirely from scratch, using the angle of the sun and the memory of Grigori's directions rather than any precise count of his own steps. It was, he would say later, the closest he ever came to understanding what it might feel like to lose the one thing that had always defined him, the ability to hold a place clearly in his mind, and finding it gone, even briefly, frightened him more than the fever itself had. Petrovich had not stopped. Search parties combed the expected northern routes for weeks, finding nothing, because Jakub had never gone north. It took Petrovich almost a month to sit down alone with his own requisitioned maps and ask himself a harder question. If I were a man who understood terrain the way I do, and wanted to disappear completely, where would I go? He traced the same frozen river Jakub had crossed on day 19. He requested, and was granted, personal authority to lead a small team directly to the southwestern rail checkpoint. He arrived 3 days before Jakub did and waited. What happened next was the moment this entire story had been building toward from its very first page. On the 50th day, cold, feverish, and closer to freedom than any prisoner from Camp 9 had ever been, Jakub walked toward the checkpoint gate, carrying a fabricated identity Grigori had helped him construct. There were 4 soldiers visible at the gate, plus 2 more near a supply shed, more than Grigori had described, and for one long moment, Jakub considered turning back into the tree line. It was the fever, more than caution, that decided against it. He was no longer certain he had another night in him. He saw the uniform first, then the face, and his stomach dropped before his mind had even finished confirming what his eyes already knew. Petrovich did not react immediately either. A junior guard near the gate, sensing something in the air without understanding what, shifted his rifle slightly on its strap. Then Petrovich walked forward, slowly, and stopped an arm's length from him. "Papers," Petrovich said. Jakub handed them over without speaking. Petrovich studied them for what felt, to Jakub, like several minutes, though it could not have been more than 30 seconds. He turned them over once. He looked up, not at the documents, but directly into Jakub's eyes. "Where does this route go?" Petrovich asked quietly, tapping the paperwork's listed rail line. Jakub understood, in that instant, exactly what was happening. Petrovich was not testing the papers. He was testing whether the man in front of him truly understood the ground the way the colonel suspected he did. Jakub answered the question, calmly, correctly, with the same exact precision he had once used to describe a walk to a mother-in-law's house. Petrovich did not respond right away. He turned and looked out past the checkpoint gate, toward the open country beyond it. 41 men, he said, not looking at him. "You'd have caught that ravine, wouldn't you, if it had been your map?" "I don't know your ravine, Colonel," Jakub said finally. Petrovich looked at him for a long moment longer, Then he folded the papers, handed them back, and said only, "Move along." Jakub did not understand, would not understand for years, exactly why. He walked through the checkpoint on legs that barely held him and did not look back, though he counted, without meaning to, every step between the gate and the first bend in the road, the same old habit surfacing one final time, as though his mind needed proof, in numbers, that the distance between himself and Camp 9 was finally real. Behind him, Petrovich stood at the gate a long while after the figure had disappeared, and never spoke of prisoner 4411 again to anyone at Camp 9 for as long as he held the post. But the hardest part of Jakub's journey was still waiting for him, and it had nothing to do with soldiers. What 13? What waited at home? Jakub made it home to southern Poland 8 years after the train first took him east. He had rehearsed the walk from the station to his old front door 10,000 times in his mind. He knew every turn of it before he ever set foot on the real street again. He stood outside the house for a long time before he could make himself walk to the door. His hand was raised to knock for nearly a full minute before he brought it down against the wood. Eva opened the door. For a moment she did not move at all. She said his name once, quietly, as though testing whether saying it might make him disappear again. Neither of them spoke for what felt, to both of them afterward, like an unbearably long time. It was Ewa who finally stepped back and let him in, and it was in stepping back that Jakub saw, past her, a man's coat hung on a hook that had once been his own. Marta appeared, 11 years old now, looking at the stranger in the doorway with polite, careful confusion. She did not know him. Of course she did not know him. A second man came into the room behind her, and stopped hard when he saw who was standing at the entrance. Alexei. Jakub recognized him distantly. Someone from before the war. No one said anything true for several minutes. Eva offered Jakub tea, out of some old reflex of hospitality, and Jakub accepted it because refusing felt like starting a fight he did not yet know how to have. He sat at a table that used to be his, in a kitchen he had once mapped from memory 1,000 times in his head, drinking tea he could not taste, while Marta stood half behind Alexei's leg, watching the stranger with an expression that broke something in Jakub more thoroughly than 8 years of snow ever had. Eva told him, eventually, quietly. 2 years earlier, after the second official notice of his death arrived, she had let herself believe it. She had married Alexei, not out of forgetting, she said, but out of trying to build something that could still function as a family for Marta's sake. "I kept the letter," she said, at one point, almost to herself. "The first one, the notice. I never showed it to her." A pause. "She asked me once, when she was 7, if her father had been brave. I told her yes. I didn't know if it was true. I only knew it was the only answer I could live with giving her." Alexei spoke for the first time since Jakub had arrived, his voice careful. "I never told her to forget you. Whatever else you think of me. I never once asked her to forget." Jakub looked at him for a moment, and something in him, some old readiness for a fight he had carried across an entire frozen country, quietly set itself down. He did not forgive Alexei in that moment, but he believed him. He did not raise his voice. He did not confront Alexei. What he did instead was ask for one thing. He asked to spend time with his daughter, properly, not as a stranger passing through, but as someone trying to become, slowly, something she might eventually choose to call her father again. Ewa did not fight him on it. The first few visits were difficult. Marta was polite with him, careful, the way she might have been with a distant relative or a stranger her mother had vouched for. She answered his questions in short sentences and did not ask him any of her own. He found himself wanting to simply tell her everything at once. The camp, the walk, the wolves, the river, as though the sheer weight of what he had endured might convince her faster than time could. He did not do this. He understood, from 2 years of learning to be patient with a plan that could not be rushed, that this, too, was a calculation that could not be forced. He came twice a week, then 3 times, sitting with her over small, ordinary things, helping with schoolwork he barely understood, in a curriculum 8 years newer than the one he remembered, listening to her describe friends and teachers, and a dog 2 houses down that she was not allowed to keep. He did not ask her to love him. He only kept arriving. It was on the 6th week that she asked him, unprompted, to tell her about the walk to her grandmother's old house, a story she had heard once from her mother, as something her father used to do. Jakub recited it for her, turn by turn, the crooked fence post included, and for the first time, Marta looked at him the way a child looks at someone she is beginning to trust, rather than someone she has been asked to be polite to. Do that again, she said, the whole thing, from the start. He did it again, and then a third time, a week later, this time reciting it back to him herself, half right, filling in the parts she had forgotten with guesses that made him laugh for the first time since he had come home. A real laugh, the kind that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her, the kind neither of them had heard from him since long before the war ever separated them in the first place. Eventually, she chose to go with him, not out of rejection of the life she knew, but because something in her understood that this quiet, careful man, with the strange gift for directions, had crossed an entire frozen country to come back for her specifically. Jakub never saw Eva again after the arrangements were settled, and he never spoke of Alexei with any real bitterness, the understanding settling in him slowly that some doors, once closed by time and grief rather than betrayal, cannot be forced back open, and the only real choice left is what gets built on the other side of that closed door. Years later, when Marta was grown, she would sometimes ask him to recite the old walk again, the one to her grandmother's house, not because she needed the directions, since the house itself no longer stood, but because hearing her father describe it, turn by turn, crooked fence post included, had become its own kind of homecoming, a small, private ritual between the two of them that neither the camp, nor the years, nor the closed door behind them had ever managed to take away. Closing note to viewers. Jakub Nowak spent 8 years memorizing every step that would bring him home. When he finally arrived, he discovered that home was no longer a place waiting for him. It was something he would have to build again, one quiet conversation with his daughter at a time. The maps he carried in his own mind had guided him across the most unforgiving stretch of frozen ground on Earth. Past guards, past wolves, past a colonel built to catch him. But no map could guide him back into his daughter's heart. Only patience could do that. Only showing up, again and again, with nothing to offer but time. So here is the question we want to leave with you. If you were Jakub, standing in that doorway, watching a life continue without you, through no real fault of anyone involved, what would you have done? Would you have fought to reclaim what was lost? Or, like Jakub, would you have let it go and built something new? One conversation, one recited walk, at a time. There is no clean right answer here, and that's exactly why we want to hear yours in the comments below. If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe, because there is more of Jakub and Marta's life still to tell, and it starts somewhere neither of them expected.